What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Every year, 1/3 of all the food we produce around the world is lost or wasted. Isn't it a pity to waste food while so many people around us are not able to satisfy their daily food needs? So, when is food wasted? Between leaving the farm and reaching our plate, food goes through a number of stages, making up what we call food chain. Unfortunately, food is wasted across the whole chain. And that's not all. When we waste food, we're also wasting all the resources that went into its production, like land, water, effort and energy. Just think of bread and the long way from the farm to our table. Did you know that to make a loaf of bread, you need 1,000 litres of water? That's a lot of water. Wave! Moreover, rotting food in landfill sites lets off a very strong, harmful gas called methane. This means that food waste harms the environment, leading to climate change. Here comes the good news though. By following some simple tips, we can all help reduce food waste at home, save money, help the environment, and support people in need. All together, we can help our community. We just need to take action and care for each other. It's easy. Start by keeping notes of the food your family throws away and try to see why. Find out what went wrong and think about how you can change habits and reduce food waste at home. Shop smart and get everyone in your family involved. Check what's already in the fridge and the cupboards. Plan your meals and make a shopping list before going to buy food. Don't buy with your eyes. Did you know that many fruits and vegetables are thrown away just because they look weird? It doesn't matter if these apples don't have a normal shape or size. They taste great and they're good for you. Always read expiration dates correctly. Let me explain. Use by appears on food which goes off quickly and is about food safety. Best before is all about quality, appearance, texture, maybe taste. But that's all. It's still safe to eat for some time beyond the best before date. So trust your own senses. Does it smell off? What does it look like? Try smaller portions to avoid waste. If you clear your plate, you can ask for more. Do the same in restaurants. And if there is still surplus, always take leftovers home. You can always store or freeze any leftovers for another time. Fruit and vegetables, of course, make delicious soups, smoothies, juices, or preserves. Or, of course, donate surplus food. Let us help get you started. Share these steps with family and friends. Join us and learn more about how to save food at home and in the community. It's easy to get involved with saving food and offering it to people in need in your very own neighborhood. Join the Saving Food community today. The Saving Food project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme.
Welcome back to AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. I'm Larry Rifkin, along with John Krofsick. And in fact, John took .com home with him last night.
I did.
Because Dot was feeling very left out.
I did. But you
did?
know what? Dot eats too much. I got to return him.
Now, is that any relative to Echo Dot?
No, I don't think so, but we'll have to find out.
Everybody's going to have those echoes.
We'll have to do the DNA.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, in your household as you were growing up, I'll bet you one of the things that Mom and Dad Krofsick said to you was waste not, want
Oh, yeah.
not,
My
right?
mom had all those sayings.
Really?
And she used to always say, never borrow or lender be.
Ah, she loved that one.
Yes.
And then you went out and you borrowed a lot of money and ran up the credit card and said, sorry, Mom, never really took that one to
But
heart.
She was good. She was good with the sayings. So.
Now, could you ever leave the table without eating everything on your plate, or was that really a point of great concern? Get back here, little Johnny.
It was hard because my mother was a terrible cook. I really have to
Really?
say. Oh, she was awful. She could burn water. She was awful. But, so if my mom was cooking, then it was very difficult. If my dad was cooking, now my dad could cook. He cooked in the Army. So he knew how to cook real food. So it was good, but it was kind of weird,
Well, I gotta tell you.
I didn't have, you hear these stories of these Italian homes.
Yeah, right.
Where they eat great food. My mother, it was awful.
Well, I got to tell you, there's a good joke that I heard the other day from the stage. I really had a great honor, and that was to interview Jimmy Webb, probably the greatest songwriter of the last 30 years in America. Up and Away, MacArthur Park, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Galveston. And I've interviewed him before, but this was for a public television special. And he was telling a story of a country star. I think maybe it was Glenn Campbell, because Glenn Campbell's wife was there because he was performing with Ashley Campbell, Glenn's daughter. And by the way, it was wonderful to meet Kim Campbell. Of course, that documentary about the last tour that he did with his family. And what Kim did to bring this issue of Alzheimer's out to the public was absolutely remarkable, sharing all of this insight with us and very personal things, too. And I gave her so much credit, and I thanked her for what she did for all of us. But there was a joke from the stage that Jimmy told, and I think it was about Glenn, because he used to love to tell jokes. And the joke was that the flies in this person's household neighborhood took up a collection to repair all the screens because they didn't want to go back in and eat all the food because it was so bad that the mom made. So that's kind of akin to your story.
It is.
Well, let's think about it, John. We were raised by a generation who came out of the Depression, and it left this indelible mark on them and their thinking about being thrifty and conserving resources, whether it was shut off the lights, turn down the heat.
I still have that trouble.
I know, we all do, I think, to some extent. But also eat the food that's presented to you. But us, not so much today.
That's true. You're right.
And one of the problems really is, John, that when you go out to eat, it is obscene. And we see the obesity that's taking place in America. It's obscene, some of the portions that are
out of
doled
control. Oh, my goodness. I mean, I can never finish them. I have to bring it home and have it for 2 more meals.
No, I know, but it's ridiculous. And you see people, they're gorging themselves. And you say, why do we have to have so much food? The only places where that's not the case is when you go to a really upscale place.
Yes, then you get these little portions.
Right, and you're spending $80 and you're saying, this must be better than I'm tasting it, because why would it cost so much?
Exactly.
But this idea that if we waste food here, then it affects someone halfway around the world has been in vogue in our thinking for a long time. I mean, fortunately, there are a lot of new technologies that have made agriculture so much more efficient. And when you look at America, when we were this agrarian society and virtually everybody was on the farm, and now you say, how do we have such abundance and about 1% of us are working the land and tilling the soil?
True. Well, we have a disconnect. We don't even know where our food comes from. I mean, I think if you asked a child today where his food comes from, he'd say the A&P or the whatever store.
Aisle 4. Yeah, I'm going out. I'm a hunter and gatherer because I'm a male. Where are you going? Stop and shop,
Yeah, I mean, so we got a huge disconnect there.
No, we do. And that is something. I mean, we're so out of touch with so much in the natural world and so many of our kids. I mean, I just heard a story, literally. Now, you're not going to believe this one, John, but that a prisoner in a maximum security prison gets more time outside than many of our children because they're required to have them outdoors in the yard for an hour, hour and a half a day. How many kids get that?
Yeah.
When you think about it. Well, we know empirically that we waste a lot of food. I mean, we know that.
We do.
And the government's been getting into the act trying to figure out ways to cut down on this. And there are some benefits, of course, from some of this waste. People are turning it into bioenergy and the like. And that's not something that we explore a lot in this podcast. But we really wanted to delve into this issue of food waste and why it's occurring and what we can do about it, and whether we have become indifferent to the whole notion, and whether, in fact, there are going to be new purposes, new uses, new opportunities, and what it says about us as a society, because no past generations really felt that they could blithely just waste food and get away with it, or that it wasn't almost a mortal sin to do that.
It's crazy when you think about it, what we do, and it's some of the stuff you even you get in your refrigerator and you see it and you wonder what that used to be.
But
it's sad.
one of the things is we become again so much more efficient in the production of food that we can kind of do this in a way that we don't feel as guilty. Well, let's talk to Professor Marc Bellemare. He's from the University of Minnesota, has really studied this issue in major international settings, and he's somebody who's got a worldwide perspective on this issue of food waste. And I doubt you're going to hear this on too many other podcasts, but if you don't think about this every day as you're ready to throw things into the garbage or recycle them, make them into compost, or put them back in the refrigerator, I doubt that's the case. I think we will at least raise your consciousness about the issue of wasting food. Marc Bellemare is with us. He's a professor at the University of Minnesota. He directs the Center for International Food and Agricultural Policy. And I really was fascinated with an article or a piece that you wrote in the Wall Street Journal, Is Food Waste Really Such a Waste? And we hear all the time that we Americans are so wasteful as it relates to our food consumption. Is that true?
Well, it depends on what definition you use. So the Wall Street Journal article, the op-ed that I wrote that you're referring to, is really, it was really kind of a way for me to publicize some scientific work I've been doing with co-authors here at the university about food waste. And so that the scientific article was published at the end of last year in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. And what my co-authors and I say in that article is, look, there are all kinds of definitions that are being used for food waste, official definitions, so United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the Environmental Protection Agency, the USDA, and so on and so forth. And very few of those definitions are, in fact, none of them are in agreement with one another. And a lot of them also seem to count as waste, things that would be kind of debatable, right? So I forget which one it is exactly. I think it's the FAO's definition. But the FAO definition, if I recall correctly, states things like, well, if something goes, if a nutritious and safe food item goes uneaten by a human, it is wasted. And so my co-authors and I, when we started working on food waste, we thought, well, wait a minute, is that really waste, right? Because I can take half the food that's on my plate and I give it to my dogs, and it still has a productive use. So we approach this whole idea from the point of view of what counts as waste in microeconomic theory. And in economic theory, waste is simply an input that is not being used in some productive process. And so what we thought is, well, if we take food and we use it as compost for our garden, that's not wasted. There is a use for it. It might not be the most efficient use, but it doesn't go to the landfill. So at the end of the day, what we came up with was a new definition of food waste, where we just simply say, look, if a food item goes to the landfill, it is wasted. If it doesn't go to the landfill, if it's used as food for a human being, as feed for an animal, as fuel, as fertilizer, then it still has a productive use, and it does not go wasted. At least not according to our definition.
Well, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, just a couple of years ago, they announced the first ever national food waste reduction goal, and they wanted a 50% reduction by 2030. What were they attempting to do, and what's their definition?
So their definition, I forget exactly what their definition is. You can find it in our article, in our AJE article. what they were simply attempting to do, and I certainly understand where they're coming from, is to improve food availability for Americans, right? So they come at this from the point of view of what's the total food available for consumption in the United States in any given year or any given day, and the logic is, well, if we waste fewer food items, there is more food that's available for consumption in the food system. So that's simply their approach to it. There are also some environmental consequences to wasting food. So food that goes to the landfill, there's an opportunity cost to having food that's simply in a landfill. It also emits greenhouse gases. But put simply, the USDA's motivation, I believe, is primarily to have more food in the food system, or to increase food availability. Because if you look at the USDA's data, where they account for food loss is they take the food availability data and then they kind of look at what is lost in terms of available food.
You say that even the most efficient supply chain isn't frictionless, so zero is not the goal. I mean, just describe, that. I think you already have, but perhaps back us around again to make certain that we understand why you don't really want to spend endless amounts of money to bring it down to zero.
Well, it's all a question of increasing costs, right? So. Generally, the cost of doing something is increasing in the scope of it. So the more you do something, the more it gets costly. But there are certain problems like that, right? Like food waste, where the cost increases at an increasing rate, meaning that this last kind of 5% or this last 1% is really, really much more costly to get rid of than the first 5%. And so any kind of system like that distributes resources, that creates them, and perishable resources, is going to have some degree of loss in it, some degree of waste in it. And to try to get rid of every single bit of food waste is overambitious. I mean, it would be, I don't know that it's even possible. So when we say that the costs are that it would be extremely costly, I think it might even border on the impossible.
What about our role and our responsibility as individuals in our society? Because it's so plentiful, our food, and relatively speaking, cheap. And I say that relatively. But you point out in your piece that, for example, we purchase fresh fruits and vegetables. This happened to me and my wife recently. We had bought a cantaloupe. We thought we were going to eat it. By the time we thought it was ripe and ready, we put it in the refrigerator, and then we forgot about it, and we ultimately threw it out, and we thought that was a waste, a terrible waste. But a lot of us do that, and you say sometimes our eyes are a little bit bigger than our mouths.
Yeah, there's a story that I like to tell when I talk about food waste, when I present my work on this, is, I've since stopped doing that, but I would say up until about a year and a half ago, so probably I stopped when I started working on food waste, but I would week in and week out buy 2 boxes of arugula at the grocery store every week. So I'm the primary grocery shopper in my household, and I would go, I go on weekends and I would buy 2 boxes of arugula, thinking I'm going to have a lot of greens this week, and inevitably, Wednesday night rolls around and you may have opened the first box and you may have made good headway in it, but you think, well, maybe we should go out to dinner tonight. And so all the best laid plans of mice and men. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is you end up with stuff. You end up over purchasing because there's kind of what financial economists call an option value, right? You think, well, look, yes, in the ideal scenario, I will eat those things. I kind of reserve the option of eating that, but I also have the option of going out if I feel like it that evening. So that's one thing. Another thing is that people suffer from what behavioral economists call hyperbolic discounting, meaning that their preferences are time inconsistent, right? So I have preferences for myself tomorrow that come tomorrow, my preferences are going to be very different, right? So I can try to bind myself and say, well, I will eat nothing but clean food, or like what people refer to as a clean diet, I think, in the blogosphere, meaning, no junk foods and stuff. And so you buy all this fresh produce, and you say, So that's what I'm going to eat for the rest of the week. And
Yeah,
then,
nothing processed, no sugars and the like. Yeah.
So as I said, Thursday or Friday nights roll around, and you think, well, this has been kind of a tiring week. Maybe we ought to go out maybe we should order pizza or something. And so what ends up happening is because of these time inconsistent preferences, we tend to we don't know ourselves very well, right? Or we think we know ourselves in the future, but the future comes around and we're still the same old person. And so by virtue of that, by virtue of wanting kind of the option of having some variety, for the reasons you're highlighting, right? Food is relatively cheap. And in fact, we are probably enjoying some of the cheapest food in all of history, so, in terms of relative prices, obviously, not in terms of absolute prices. And so all those factors kind of conspire to make us say, to waste a little bit of our food. And so, and that's just kind of a feature, I think, of the system. It's not necessarily a bug.
You also remind us that saving edible food from going to waste is not the same as sending it to feed the hungry, that's not exactly the way it works.
Yeah, so my perspective when it comes to that, I was trained as a development economist. So I've done and I still do a lot of work on agricultural development, so the development of modern agricultural sectors in developing countries, that is. And so when I'm always kind of baffled by the juxtaposition of, well, there's this many people who are going hungry in the world, and we're wasting this much food. And my first thought when I hear this is, yes, okay, on a local level, I certainly understand that, if my local grocery store decides that it's taking its day old or stuff that's slightly past due and giving it,
to the food bank,
kitchen, that completely makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I tend to think about those things at the international level, because when I hear hungry people, my mind defaults to people who are food insecure in, say, sub-Saharan Africa instead of, in the Twin Cities. So though it might be possible to do a certain amount of reallocation at a local level, I don't think it's feasible at the global level. I mean, I was reading something a couple of months ago that said that I think 70% of the food consumed in the world is consumed locally, right? So we always tend to think of, well, international trade will take care of this and that problem.
Mm.
In the case of food, it's less true. You can't ship food for very long or over very long distances, or put differently, you can't ship all kinds of foods that way, right? We can certainly ship stuff that's processed and that's made to be shipped over long distances, but there's way less international trade of food, I think, than people tend to think of, generally speaking.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of us have read recently where a lot of our fish may be coming from parts unknown, from China and other places.
Yeah.
I mean, how good is this global distribution network of food that we have?
Well, so fish is different because it's funny you should ask about this, because I have done some work on the international trade of seafood. Fish and seafood are some of the most traded commodities internationally. So that would be kind of taking an outlier on that basis. But for food in general, right, what I saw was that 70% of all food is consumed kind of in the country where it is produced, with fish and seafood being a clear exception. And we can talk about, the international trade of fish and seafood if you'd like.
Well, no, but I was just curious about it in relation to what you had said. So you're saying that I did pick out an outlier in this conversation. What about food getting across the United States? I mean, I live in a northern state, you live in a northern state, and we're still enjoying fruits and vegetables in the winter. Explain that process to us.
So there's a lot of that comes from Latin America. And there's also a lot of it that comes from California, which has a climate to grow those fruits and vegetables, and also the varieties that we have kind of developed and that we are growing are well suited to be shipped over long distances. I'm always somewhat amused when I hear my friends and colleagues say, "Oh, in Europe the produce is just so much better." And look, I've lived in Rome. My first job after I finished my master's, before I went to grad school, was in Rome. And yes, it is true that the produce was amazing over there, but I lived right across the kind of the Roman distribution center for fresh produce, the general markets, and I would hear trucks arrive from the countryside every night around midnight with fresh stuff. You just don't have that happening here, right? I mean, it travels over much longer distances in the United States. I can't have a truck of fresh lettuce or fresh tomatoes that have been picked, last night or yesterday afternoon arrive in Minneapolis at 9 in the morning or something, or it would be another thing that would be very, very costly if we were to do this. So I think we just have we just tend to grow things that do much better over longer distance. Yeah.
Our consumption patterns as individuals in the United States, it just seems to me, and this is an area that deals with food, but it may not be something directly in your scope, but it seems to me like we are almost gluttonous. When we go out for a meal, there's often so much more food than any one individual should be eating at that moment in time and generally can eat. Is that true?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, and again, if I can cite international examples, right? I was just in Germany last week, and Germany is known for having large portions in Europe, and their portions struck me as maybe significantly smaller. I mean, not substantially, but significantly smaller than U.S. portions. And I think, again, it's just the fact that food is relatively cheap in the United States. And so if you have two restaurants competing, trying to outdo one another, one of the dimensions that they can compete on is how much food are you giving people. And it's come to a point where Americans expect to have large portions, right? I mean, it used to baffle me. So I was born and raised in Canada, and when I moved to the U.S. for graduate school, I thought, well, these portions are humongous, and I thought, well, how can people eat all of that? And it took me kind of a long time. I was really slow on the uptake on that one, but it took me a long time. And it wasn't until my wife, who's American, told me, look, we go out with the expectation of taking half home and eating it the next day. That I finally realized that was the whole idea. But you're right that because food is cheap and plentiful, restaurants that are competing against one another can afford to kind of offer larger portions. Feed what anyone reasonably would like to eat.
Or should eat. When we see we've got an obesity problem, I mean, when you hear all of the conversations about obesity, how do you, as someone who studies food and agriculture, how do you react to it?
And as someone who also has some weight to lose, by the way. So it's funny you should bring that up because when I presented my work on food waste at the American Economics Association meetings in Chicago in January 2017, one of my colleagues, one of my very well-known colleagues who's at UC Berkeley, his first comment was to say, you shouldn't work on this topic. And I said, okay, why? And he said, well, we obviously have an obesity problem in this country, and his sincere belief was that we should be wasting more food and not less food. So I think all those things go hand in hand. Food being cheap means that we live in an environment where we can eat all the time, right? Most of us have easy access to food that is not too expensive and that is filling and that tastes good. Food companies do a lot of R&D in order to make sure that things taste good, and that's another dimension along which they compete. At the same time, the fact that food is cheap also means that it is a much smaller share of our budget, right? And so that buying a box of arugula and leaving it kind of in the back of the fridge for one more week than we should, and then realizing, oh man, I shouldn't have bought that, and having to throw it away, it's less of a financial hit than it used to be. So again, if I may kind of appeal to the international experience, I've done some field work for my dissertation in Madagascar, and in Madagascar, people in rural areas spend, or at least they did right around the time I was there, which was in the early 2000s, some people would spend up to 85% of their household budget on staples, mainly rice. That is a whole lot of money when you think about it, right? When every dollar you bring in, you can spend 80 cents. You spend 80 cents of it on food. In the United States, it's a lot lower than that. The budget share of food for the average household is less than 10%. And that includes food away from home, which tends to be more expensive. So with food being this cheap, it's no surprise that we eat too much of it, and it's no surprise that we kind of that we don't really think twice about wasting it.
Exactly. Explain to me, in your op-ed piece, you say that the UN says that 5.9 billion people who live in developing countries and the 1.2 billion in industrialized ones waste roughly the same amount of food, about 715 million tons a year. How do we explain that?
Well, the disconnect is simply that people tend to waste food a lot more per person in wealthy countries because food is cheaper than they do in developing countries. So the bulk of people, the vast majority of people in this example live in developing countries. They waste as much as we do in rich countries simply because I think it's mostly a commentary on how much food we waste in the U.S. and other OECD countries.
We'll return to this episode of America Trends in just a moment. If you like what we're doing here at America Trends Podcast, please don't keep it to yourself. I know there are a lot of people, John, who think, well, if I'm listening and somebody else wants to listen at the same time, maybe we're going to collide and they're not going to be able to hear us.
Yeah.
Is that the way the technology works?
No, there's plenty of bandwidth. Everybody can listen at the same time.
All right. Well, that
sure you do
dispels
that.
that myth. Now, you can do a number of things that would really be helpful to us. You could give us a kind rating or a review at Apple Podcasts, and that boosts what they consider to be our value and visibility. And what does that do, John?
Well, that puts us in the forefront so that you can find us easier, and most important is other people can find us easier.
And you can subscribe there or on our site, americatrendspodcast.com, or wherever you're listening, so we can alert you to new episodes of the podcast, which, by the way, we put out twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And stay in touch with us on both Facebook and Twitter at Trends Podcast. Or you can like us on Facebook or follow us where, John?
On Twitter.
On Twitter, that's right, where the world turns to hear fake news or whatever it is. Well,
Not
you can
us, though.
direct
We
message
have real
us
news.
at Trends Podcast or using hashtag Trends Podcast. And John, with our growing audience, and really it's been pretty remarkable, a lot of people just came to us the last month or two, and they might have missed earlier episodes. Can they get them again?
They can look through them and pick the ones they want to listen to. They're all on the website, and a lot of them are up on iTunes, many of them.
All right. Well, listen, there's lots of material to listen to. We hope you have the time, and we'll lend it to us because we try to make it worth your while. And thanks so much for listening.
And tell your friends.
We now return to this episode of America Trends.
Wasted food has a big impact on climate change, as most of it ends up in landfill sites where it rots and releases methane into the environment. The best thing we can do with our food is enjoy it, but some waste like eggshells, banana skins and tea bags is inevitable. Many councils now collect food waste, which can be recycled in one of two ways. The first, in-vessel composting, involves mixing food waste with garden waste, shredding it and composting it in a tunnel or container for around 2 to 4 weeks. Temperatures of up to 70 degrees C speed up the process and kill any harmful microbes. It is then left for a further 1 to 3 months with regular turning and checks to ensure quality before going on to be used as soil conditioner. The second method, anaerobic digestion, uses microorganisms called methanogens to break down food waste, animal manures and energy crops in the absence of oxygen inside an enclosed tank. As it breaks down, it gives off biogas, which is collected and used to generate electricity, heat or transport fuels. It also creates biofertilizer that can be used in farming and land regeneration. Ask your council if they recycle food waste and which foods you can include. Visit recyclenow.com for tips on recycling more of your waste.
When we look at all this food waste and the issue itself, there are a lot of people who are now talking about the importance of considering food waste as an energy source and diverting a portion of the world's food waste to waste-to-energy systems could free up large amounts of landfill. How confident are you in that technology and that development?
That's something I'm completely ignorant about. I have to confess that this is something I'm not an engineer. I have never really thought about this aspect of the question. It is interesting to me. I'm hopeful, but I just have no idea how realistic it is. It would be wonderful if we could divert that wasted food towards making new energy, though.
Well, there are these new devices called anaerobic digesters, and there are some who say that when you just look at the composition of things like discarded pastries or whatever it may be, that they might, or even unsold bananas or oranges and apples from a grocery store, that they might be able to provide an ample supply of fuel. Is that anything that in your conversations with other scholars in this field they're excited about?
Yeah, I think it's mostly on the engineering side, the people who are not social scientists, basically, right? Who kind of understand all the hard science behind what happens to the food that goes wasted and what's the potential for it. But again, it's not something that I'm intimately familiar with. I would say that the closest I came to this was when I watched Back to the Future 2, right, where they powered the DeLorean with some food waste.
Well, now they're talking about this waste-to-energy technology market as potentially growing from where it is today at about $6.2 billion to $29.2 billion by 2022. If that did occur, what do you think that would do to this conversation and even the material that you're writing today about food waste if we were able to convert it in that way? How much would that change the debate that's going on about the utility and the trade-offs and, how much we should work toward limiting food waste?
It would depend on who you talk to, right? Because some people, as I said, come at this from an angle of, look, we've got food insecure people in the world, in the United States. And I certainly understand the moral implications of wasting food when we have people who can't eat. So if that's the angle that someone is approaching it from, taking food that's wasted, that say goes to the landfill or what have you, and converting it into energy is not going to feed people, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it is slightly less exciting for someone who worries about food waste from a food security perspective to see those innovations in terms of converting food into fuel. For individuals who are worried about, the environment, climate change, and so on and so forth, or simply about, minimizing waste of whatever stripe, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's slightly more exciting.
Oh, exactly, because there's no drilling or fracking or mining involved.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, you pointed to the fact that we have a lot of food scientists, and since you are the director of the Center for International Food and Agricultural Policy, I ran into a gentleman once who was one of these food scientists at one of the major companies, I think it was General Mills. I mean, how fascinating is this field that they are able to manufacture these foodstuffs and food products that are, well, barely food, but they certainly are appealing to most of us.
Yeah, it's quite. I mean, it's a sector. It's a technological sector like any other, right? It's really interesting, all the various combinations of flavors and ingredients that they can come up with, the marketplace does interesting things in that sense of when two kind of firms try to compete with one another. And they compete along that dimension, say taste or price, and it's more than that, right? I was reading a book called Gastrophysics, where this kind of whole new area of investigation. It's written by a chef, but it's about how food is a different experience if you eat it, say, under a white light versus under a red light, and so shapes, colors, smells, appearances, and tastes. Right? All those things really matter at the end of the day.
When we hear big pharma or we hear big medicine, we get this certain notion of something that has gotten a little bit proportionally out of control. When you hear the term big food, and you think about all this processed food in America, and that's part of the reason that perhaps we look upon food as being so readily available that we don't value it perhaps in the way that we should. What comes to mind for you in this whole big food area in terms of its impact on our appetites, our diet, and food policy overall?
Well, first off, when I hear big food, I think someone's trying to scare me, and I'm not scared by it. Look, we are at a point in the economic development of this country where economies of scale mean that certain industries will tend towards few firms doing a lot of the production, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we see this happening in food and beverage industry. We see this happening in agriculture, where we went from having many, many small family farms to having way fewer but very large farms. So for me, when I hear this, as a development economist, right, if I may circle back to that, it tells me that we are at a very advanced stage of economic progress, that this is what comes with being a wealthy nation where most people have enough to eat, and that's just kind of, it just comes with the territory of being a rich country.
And what about around the world? When you look at the situation as it relates to food, its availability, its cost, its nutritional value, around the world, how are we doing today?
We're doing considerably better than we were doing, say, 20 years ago. So when I started, I was telling you I worked in Rome when I finished, just before grad school. I worked for a UN agency that was doing some work on international development, and hunger, it was a very pressing problem at the time. I mean, look, I happen to believe that whenever we have any hunger in the world, it is a pressing problem, but there were many, many more people who were suffering from food insecurity, from hunger at the time than we have now, right? So we've made considerable strides in terms of increasing agricultural productivity, of getting food to people, of building distribution networks. The problem is not resolved, right? We still have what we now refer to as the dual burden of malnutrition, where we have some countries where we have a coexistence of people who don't eat enough and who have all kinds of physical ailments as a consequence, and of people who are obese. So that this is what we refer to by this dual burden. So we've shifted, I think, the problem from having too many people who don't eat enough to having considerably fewer people who don't eat enough, but also way too many people who eat too much. And so, it's whatever we are suffering from in terms of public health problems, it's just coming to countries that are becoming wealthier and that are industrializing.
Marc Bellemare, I want to thank you for joining us today to talk about food waste, food policy, distribution around the world, and even speculating a little bit about food to energy. I thank you so much for coming by on America Trends.
Thank you for having me, Larry.